Sir, I have one question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Like radiation in pulsars is purely because of rotation, or do we consider stellar oscillations also, even if for a small part of the radiation?
If you have oscillations, then that signature will be there. No? So you should see the oscillation period. And oscillation period for neutron stars are millisecond to sub-millisecond. They're very, very fast. And we don't see such signatures in this. Oscillations are seen in some magnetar hyperflares and so on. But in pulsars, we have never seen anything directly related to oscillations.
Okay. In general, like apart from pulsars, like what kind of radiation does stellar oscillation produce? Say even the sun.
Typically, the stellar oscillation modulates the radiation. For example, a regular main sequence star or even a slightly evolved star, when it oscillates, for example, radial oscillations. So if its radius changes in size, its net luminosity will also change. So that will give you a change in intensity as a function of time at the oscillation period. And this is well known for various types of stars. For example, Cepheids or RLI stars and so on. So where the oscillations are used to sort of calibrate their luminosity distances and things like that. So normally oscillations are used to modulate the intensity, which are produced in some other manner. But oscillations changes the local characteristics so that the net intensity going out can change.
Okay, sir. One question, like I read in, studied in another course where they touched pulsars. Like they were actually mentioning that general relativistic effects are stronger in the fastest rotating pulsars, like millisecond pulsars. Is this what like we were discussing during the lectures? Were they specifically millisecond pulsars, or is it general relativistic effects we studied are in general for all types of pulsars, like with respect to period?
There are two effects in general relativity that you will see. Okay. One is the fact that the star has a strong gravity, right? Whether it rotates or not, that aspect of the GR effect will always be there. But when you have strong rotation, then you have another effect, which is called frame dragging.
Frame dragging effect, yes, sir.
The frame dragging effect becomes stronger and stronger as you have faster rotation.
Yes, sir.
So that is one reason why more fast rotating pulsars will show a manifestation of that part, which is stronger. There is also another aspect to it, and that is the light cylinder of a millisecond pulsar is much closer to the surface than the light cylinder of a slower rotating pulsar. Now, as you go away from the surface, the general relativistic effects will diminish in magnitude. But the magnetosphere of a millisecond pulsar being contained within the light cylinder is much closer to the surface. So therefore, all effects due to general relativity within the magnetosphere will be stronger. Simply because we are looking at a region which is much closer than in the case of slowly rotating pulsars.
Sir, can you like summarize the light cylinder part you mentioned? I lost track while noting.
You know what is the distance of the light cylinder from the center of the neutron star? How far is it?
C by omega, right?
Correct. So the larger the omega, what happens to the light cylinder?
It will decrease.
Correct. So it will come closer to the surface.
Yes, yes.
The gravity is stronger closer to the surface.
Okay, okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Understood.
Yeah. So can someone read out the question one by one?
Sure, I'll do that. So the first question was about numerical modeling techniques. Essentially, I think Abhay wants to know how far we can get with freely available codes in terms of modeling these pulsar magnetospheres.
Yeah, so unfortunately, these codes are not made freely available. The groups which have built them, starting with Spitkovsky and his collaborators, they have spent about 10 to 12 years, almost getting to be 15 years on these codes. And they share it with their collaborators, but it is not openly shared. They are beginning to share them with some pulsar theorists who are working on the radiation mechanisms. So their codes mainly are on the magnetosphere. And then they have added, with Filipov, they have added the PIC part to it, where you have particles explicitly calculated in the electric field and magnetic field in the magnetosphere. So these are now being shared with a small number of groups which are doing the radiation mechanisms, but they are not openly available. There are a couple of groups which have developed these codes independently. For example, Beloborodov and Cheruti, they have a separate set of codes, but they give similar results. So that's independently developed. But nothing is available in the public domain.
Sir, what I was wondering is, since there are some, I think, MHD equations, will it be possible to at least have some basic codes in such field available and one can build on that?
No, there are many MHD codes available in the public domain. For example, Pluto, Athena, the Pencil code, there are various others. But they do not deal with relativistic plasma.
Okay.
So the main issue with this is relativistic plasma and all the additional complications that come from it. So you need to add both special relativity and the plasma with particles which have kinetic energy much larger than the rest energy. Plus, you need to also add strong GR effects. So, these are typically not available in the publicly open codes. Relativity is treated in some approximate perturbative manner in the publicly open codes, which is not enough for pulsar magnetospheres.
How useful will be the ones that, simulate the jets and so on in the AGNs?
Yeah, so for example, Athena is one such code. Jets in AGNs are also done by Pluto. But it will never give you the kind of, because those sort of inject inertial plasma in a region which is far away from the event horizon of the black hole. So we are talking about regions which are hundreds to thousands of gravitational radius, which will not suffice to do pulsar magnetosphere.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is clarification about the two-beam instability. The plasma in the magnetosphere is interacting with the newly created plasma of relativistic ions pulled out of the polar cap. The pairs produced by high energy gamma rays. He wants to know whether this is...
Yeah, so there are two sets of plasmas, or even multiple sets of plasmas you can think of. One is the primary particles, which are the ones which get accelerated in the full potential drop inside a gap region. So they get the maximum energy. and these could be ions. And so they will be moving at a much higher, with a much higher Lorentz factor than the secondary plasma, which is generated by pair production by the photons which these primaries generate. So the Lorentz factor distribution of the secondary plasma will have a much lower Lorentz factor distribution than much lower values than the primary plasma. So the primary plasma is going to move through this region. So it's like a beam moving through a plasma. So that's the beam plasma instability that one talks about.
Okay, sir.
The third one is about whether there's any relation between the angle of the rotation axis and the magnetic axis of the pulsar to its period, and whether from observations one can determine the tilt angle of the pulsar, magnetic angle, I suppose.
Yeah, so there is no evidence that at birth there is any correlation between the magnetic axis and the spin axis. There is no evidence, but a correlation may be there. It is not that easy to find a large number of pulsars which are just one. Whether over time the spin axis and magnetic axis align or counter align and so on has been a question that has been addressed for a long time. There is no great evidence one way or another, but there could be mild evidence of alignment over time. That pulsars which are longer period, spent a longer time, larger spin down age, may on average have a smaller alignment, smaller alignment angle between the magnetic axis and rotation axis. This evidence is still weak. We cannot take it for granted, but there is some weak evidence for this.
Sir, so what I wanted to know is when we get the observation of pulsar, what is the first estimate whether we are looking directly to the pulsar or the angle of looking as well as the magnetic axis and rotation axis?
Yeah, so these three can be determined from the rotating vector model. So if you see the pulsar polarization angle swing, that data is used to determine these two angles. The angle between the spin axis and the magnetic axis, and the angle between the spin axis and the view axis or line of sight. So you can solve for these two quantities by looking at the shape of the polarization angle as a function of pulse phase. So that's how these quantities are measured.
Okay.
Yeah, just a side comment, Deepankar.
Yeah.
Brad always was unhappy about people calling it a rotating vector model. He always insisted on it being called a magnetic pole model. And the reason is that one is looking at the structure within the cone, right?
Yeah.
With spokes making certain angle with respect to the local constant longitude line, right?
Yes, yes.
It turns out that the description of a rotating vector, which is, if you put a stick along the magnetic axis and rotate the star and look at its projection on the sky, it's exactly the same as what you would see internally as a structure of the spokes with respect to this. Okay. So mathematically they are equivalent.
Yeah.
But the physical picture is...
I agree. But the name has stuck.
Yeah, the name has stuck. And Dick Manchester was very unhappy when he was told this. He said, no, it is rotating vector model.
Yes.
So when we try to explain the Vela nebula, X-ray nebula, and when we're invoking particle flow along the magnetic axis, we said, now this is the rotating vector model.
Yes, that's right. That's correct. Yes.
It was a late realization for me that the rotation effects are not taken into account in the original Radhakrishnan and Cook model, right? It was incorporated only with Blaskovich.
Yeah, so you mean the sweep back effect?
Right.
Yeah, so sweep back effect was incorporated later.
The original model is assuming it's essentially stationary and the line of sight cuts through the.
Yeah, so original model is applicable if the emission region is close to the stellar surface, where the sweep back effects are negligible.
Also, the relativistic effects are
negligible. How to find out whether a neutron star is isolated or is in a binary system? So if a neutron star is in a binary system, then the neutron star will move around the center of mass of the binary system. So if the neutron star happens to be a pulsar, then you will see its pulse period being modulated because of this rotation. And you can easily see whether the neutron star is executing an orbit around something by just following the pulse period as a function of time. Or in fact, what people do is the pulse arrival time as a function of time. So this is called pulsar timing. And that can reveal even very, very tiny motions, because this can be done very accurately.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
This question is related to the previous one. If the binary system is in the persistent phase, means below certain luminosity, we cannot get the pulsation, right? So how can I differentiate whether a neutron star is in a binary system or is isolated?
You're talking about an accreting binary system.
Okay. Yeah.
So yes. If accretion is going on, then you will know. Just the fact that X-rays are getting generated, it means that something should supply that matter. It could come from diffuse interstellar medium, but we know that if it's just a diffuse interstellar medium supplying matter, then the level of that accretion is much, much lower than the matter is being supplied by a binary companion. So whether or not you see pulsations, if you see a neutron star emitting strong X-rays, then the matter has to come from somewhere. There has to be a companion.
Okay. So can we, from that perspective, can differentiate whether the compact object is a black hole or a neutron star?
Just from X-rays, you may not. There are other aspects that you have to look at. For example, spectra. So we know that neutron stars have a surface. Black holes don't. So when you look at the entire X-ray spectrum, going from very soft X-rays to hard X-rays, then because of the presence of the surface, the neutron stars have a characteristic spectrum, which is missing in black holes. So if you can get good spectra over this entire region, then just from spectrum alone, you can make a very good guess whether it's a neutron star or a black hole.
Okay. In the soft X-ray range?
No, it has to be
the
all
characteristic
the way from soft X-ray to hard X-rays. You have to go from below keV to about 50, 60 keV.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir.
That just got to do with the temperature, typical temperatures you expect?
Typical temperatures you expect. But if you just have a tiny bit of the spectrum, then what happens is the disk can also produce something, some thermal spectrum. So you have to well model the disk spectrum, take it out, and then see whether there is a spectrum from the boundary layer. And that boundary layer is going to give you an indication whether there is a surface or not. Now, this is only for very weakly magnetized neutron stars. For strongly magnetized neutron stars, you have something else. In most of those cases, you will actually see pulsations, which you will not see for black holes. So once you see pulsations, then you can always safely say that this is a neutron star. Or today, you can even say that it's a white dwarf. The pulsations, just the fact that it pulsates can also come from white dwarfs, although the periods are much longer. But the pulsations will be seen when the flow is channeled in a narrow funnel onto the magnetic poles, and then poles get hot and then they spin. So in that flow, you have a separate type of spectrum, which is magnetically confined matter, decelerated by the presence of a surface. When you have a much lower magnetic field, you have a spectrum which is from the boundary layer, which is substantially large in this case, spreads over a large part of the surface. And if you're lucky, you can also see from time to time the matter which accumulates on the surface undergoing thermonuclear bursts. And then you see X-ray bursts. Once you see X-ray bursts require this surface. So that again will tell you that this is a neutron star and not a black hole. So there are these various indicators which people use to differentiate between neutron stars and black holes. Pulsations, boundary layer, X-ray bursts. These are among various other indicators. Of course, if you do know what the companion mass is, in many cases from spectral type, you can determine the mass of the companion. And then by looking at the spectrum of the companion and its Doppler shift and so on, you can even estimate the mass of the compact star in some cases. And if that mass happens to be, say, 5 solar mass or 10 solar mass, then you can never have a neutron star of that mass. So then you definitely know that it is a black hole.
So you are saying that that means using the Kepler's third law, we can calculate the mass, right? Are you saying the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you have to have enough measurables. So you have to have,
yeah.
How we determine the modulation in the context of pulsars. Modulation just means to what degree the flux is modulated. So you take flux as a function of time, you have a minimum value of the flux, you have a maximum value of the flux in a modulation cycle. And typically the modulation index is Imax minus Imin divided by Imax plus Imin. That's what the modulation index is normally defined as. Okay, so these are about modes of radio emission. This question is, why do some pulsars show B and Q radio modes? What does this say about the emission process and so on? This is actually fairly complicated. I don't think there is a very clear-cut explanation for this. This all has to do with the plasma processes that I have already mentioned in the radio emission lectures. So you have to treat the entire magnetosphere as a complicated energized plasma. And there are various modes which can occur in these plasmas, and some modes may convert into radiation in some conditions and some modes may not. I don't think the detailed understanding of this is still available, except to say that these are different plasma modes in this pair plasma, which is in the magnetosphere. Desh, if you have anything to add, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the names B and Q are simply relating to bright and the quiescent mode. So the one it might differ from one pulsar to another as to which one is the bright mode and how often it occurs, or there is no particular rule by which they, exhibit one of the two modes more often than otherwise.
Sir, is there a particular cutoff or something through which we define that a mode is a bright mode and the other one is a quiet one?
Well, it's the relative intensity comparison.
There is no hard cutoff, as in like it should be twice as bright, thrice as bright or something.
The profile is different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Typically, the pulse profile will change between these two modes. And one of these modes has lower intensity than the other mode. So whichever is the brighter one, you call it bright. Whichever is the lower one, less bright one, you call it quiescent.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that these are two modes and not just intensity changing in a single mode is defined by the pulse profile change.
Okay. And one more question I have is that I have seen this in one of the pulsars at least, that an interpulse is visible at higher frequencies, whereas when I observe the same pulsar at lower frequencies, the interpulse is not there, or maybe the sensitivity is low. So is it possible that the interpulse is only visible at higher frequencies and not at the lower frequencies?
Beaming geometry is slightly different. When you say higher frequencies, these are all radio frequencies you're talking about?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So as you know, we have discussed a bit of radius to frequency mapping. So
yeah,
you can have different beam shapes for different frequencies. Now, when you say interpulse, it is likely that interpulse is originating in the other pole. So
yeah,
perhaps one can construct a geometry by which when you have these different frequencies and their different beaming directions, in some frequencies you cut the other pole in your line of sight, and other frequencies you don't. That may be possible. One has to really work out.
Okay, so it's
geometry.
Purely geometry based.
It could be. That one has to check it out. But sensitivity is also another thing. It depends on what kind of telescopes are being used, what kind of background is present. So up to what level you are seeing the emission compared to the main pulse, what is the dynamic range of your observation at these different frequencies will also matter, of course. Because it may be there, but you're not seeing it simply because your observations are not sensitive enough. That's also possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
But just from the geometry and the way beams are expected to evolve with frequency, where they are given the dipole geometry, they often get to be broadening towards lower frequency.
That's right. So this is going to be the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's less likely that by just given an arbitrary situation that you will see something at high frequency and that will be missing at low frequency, unless you're talking of, as Deepankar first asked, are you talking of radio range? Within the radio range. Otherwise, the beam sizes could be very different from X-rays to radio.
Right.
And so there is a classic example of Vela pulsar where you do see an interpulse at high energies, which is completely missing at in radio, even down to very low level.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what may happen is that if the low frequency regions are pushed very close to the light cylinder, then the sweep back effect and so on may change the beam direction somewhat. And perhaps you may miss it, perhaps you may not. That's why I said that it is not a straightforward thing. One has to really look at the geometry very carefully to see if you can manage to do this.
it might be more likely situation could be more, at least some picturization is possible rather easily in the single pole model, which shows an interpulse like feature because you cut the cone twice. There might be some, contrived geometry which might help to miss it.
Yeah, that's also possible.
Okay, but this is
but then the interpulse would not be 180 degrees apart typically.
Yeah, it is 180 degrees away from the main one. Yeah.
And do you remember if it was a millisecond pulsar? Sorry.
Oh, no, it's not a millisecond pulsar. I think the period is around 0.7 seconds.
Which pulsar is this?
This is J1825 minus 0935. And if I remember correctly, the pulsar also shows an interesting behavior where at higher frequencies, it is seen that when there is a bright mode in the main pulse, the interpulse shows a quiet mode and so on.
Yeah. Maybe, it may also be, but you might see the interpulse. There could also be moding. That could also be hampering the wave.
Yes. Yeah, that is why I want to ask how to define whether a mode is a bright one or a quiet one.
Are there any constraints on the height at which the radio emission is coming for millisecond pulsars?
It is somewhat difficult to do this typical radius to frequency mapping or even rotating vector model and so on don't quite work with millisecond pulsar geometry. So I don't think there is a very clear understanding of this for millisecond pulsars. But the light cylinder is very close, so it can't be very, very far away.
Well, similar to high energy emission, is it possible that it could be coming from near the light cylinder or even outside? Or is it unlikely?
I don't know whether that's viable. You still have to make a coherent emission for these guys in radio. And as you go far away outside the light cylinder and so on, to create a coherent mode in that plasma may or may not be easy. One has to think about that.
Fortunately, the potential difference that is created in the acceleration zone is pretty similar in both cases. Normal pulsars as well as things. The periods and fields being so different, the combination works out pretty much.
The surface voltage is quite similar. And so near the surface, nothing prevents similar effects from occurring.
I mean, it's understandable for plasma acceleration and cascading and all that, but coherent emission requires some special conditions to be satisfied. That might be hard in different regions of millisecond pulsars.
Yeah, I would
like the two
as you go further and further away, it might get even more and more difficult.
Yeah,
because bunches charges are sort of diluting out.
But it's also very hard to produce it close. At let's say 10% of the light cylinder or something for millisecond pulsars, right?
On what basis would you say that?
Okay, the gaps would be smaller, but would it have enough time for it to have that two-stream instability and then produce these charge bunches?
Yeah, so that's the question I
that region.
ask. I mean, how long does it take for the bunches to develop and so on? So it's a quantitative analysis that is needed. So in principle, this is possible, but whether you have time for this instability to develop or not, that one has to see. The actual values of the magnetic fields are much smaller. So that will change some things qualitatively.
And the curvature changes pretty rapidly due to the rotation related effects, short distance. And one distinct difference that is noticeable, unless there are exceptions which I have not come across, is most of the normal pulsars seem to show a turnover in their intensity towards the low frequency, where the intensity is highest at certain frequency and then begins to fall as you go to lower frequency. That is so far not seen in the millisecond pulsars, if that has any clue.
So spectrum continues to low frequencies without turnover.
What does that say? I mean, the turnoff, what does that say for slowly rotating pulsars?
So turnover it typically is attributed to the plasma frequency in the pulsar magnetosphere, right? So,
no, here I think
it's not the curvature.
No, I think it's more like the amount of gain from coherence.
Gain from coherence. Right.
Not continuing to increase once you the local wavelength, in the sense in the co-moving frame of the plasma becomes comparable to the size of the system. Then you don't gain further as you do with increasing lambda when things are small. And so that is one possibility that has been considered. And if that is true, then you will see here that you don't get very far. You're not going to larger distances for the system sizes to change. Other than the fact that, of course, the cone is wider.
Yes.
But then one has to compare both these and see which one wins.
Okay, there is a question, basic question. What is interpulse? So normally what you see in a pulsar emission is, what you expect is when the pole that is emitting a beam and the beam crosses your line of sight, you get a burst of emission, and that is your pulse. And this pulse will make its appearance again after one rotation period. However, there are some pulsars where in between the view of this pulse, you may also see another burst of emission, and that is called interpulse. Typically, if you are getting a view of the other pole as well, then this interpulse will come almost 180 degrees away in phase, which is half a rotation period away. In some cases, the interpulse origin is not from the other pole, but from the same pole, but because of some specific beam shape, in which case the interpulse may come at another different longitude with respect to the main pulse. But basically, between the main pulse and the main pulse appearing again, if there is another additional emission that you see at any other longitude, that's called an interpulse.
I think just before the last chain of discussion, Indulekha unmuted herself to ask some question. Was that by accident, or you had a question?
Sir, I have one question. In case of nulling pulsars, we see intermittent pulses, but the intensity continues to be same in those pulses. Is that correct? And how is it happening? Because one can probably expect that intensity also goes down as the pulsar starts to shut down.
Typically, that does not happen. I mean, you have the pulses as you know, even without nulling, individual subpulses in a pulsar, I mean, in each period, you may see only one subpulse. They have a large range of intensities. So from pulse to pulse, the intensities can vary quite a lot, whether or not there is nulling. So on an average, that doesn't seem to be a graded decrease in this intensity as you go into nulling. So it just nulls at some point, and then it reappears again at some point. I don't think there is a gradual pickup of intensity either. So whatever happens, it happens within a spin period, or maybe a couple of spin periods. The rate of change of the magnetospheric condition, which leads to nulling, such a change takes place within a small number of spin periods.
Okay, sir. Okay.
I don't know the difference between subpulse and interpulse. That is one thing. The other thing was, this young lady was talking about the interpulse also showing specific modes. And so the question I wanted to ask there was, I couldn't figure out what she was referring to. Is she saying that the interpulse is also showing modes? And is that the situation? The other question is, if you take a nulling pulsar, said that the nulling takes place across just a few rotations. If there are concerted observations, can one track the spectrum across the nulling itself? Is it possible? And does that give any information of the nulling process?
Now, what is spectrum across nulling meaning?
Like, look at the, have observations at different frequencies across that time span.
Yeah, people have done. This is a very well pursued study of what is the nature of the nulls, simultaneous multi-frequency observations and so on. They have all been attempted. So I don't think it shows any gradual change going to nulling, which is statistically significant as far as I know. But there could be some signatures in subpulses, subpulse drifts and so on. I think there are certain signatures which begin to change just before nulling occurs. But in terms of pulse intensity or spectrum, I don't recall coming across any serious change as we approach a null. Now, your other questions, one was about moding in interpulses. That's not surprising if you happen to see emission from both the poles, one pole giving you the main pulse, the other pole giving you the interpulse. So the properties of emission should not be that different. And if moding can occur in the main pulse, it should occur in the interpulse as well. Could occur in the interpulse as well. It doesn't mean it has to. So it's just that you happen to have a view of both poles in this pulsar. In some pulsars, you may not have. When you're talking about subpulses and interpulses, subpulses are fractions of pulses which occur within the main pulse envelope. The main pulse of a pulsar has a certain average profile. But every single pulse that you see from the pulsar will not illuminate that entire average profile. It will illuminate only a small bit of it. And that is called a subpulse. Once you have maybe hundreds to thousands of pulses and add the emission, only then you can build up the full main pulse profile, or the pulse profile, not just main pulse profile, the full pulse profile. So in each rotation, you may only see a small fraction of that main pulse. And those are called subpulses.
Okay, thank you.
In fact, the components of a profile, even a complex profile, almost appear to be describing the probability density distribution of occurrence of the subpulses, as if the subpulses are, some quantum of energy, even if although they show themselves huge variety in intensity. But if you think of them as sort of superposition of many such, they occur more often in the locations where the component heights, components are well defined and tall, and they occur less often on the base of it or towards the edge of it, and so on. So unless you really have good statistics of these subpulses, you really do not get a good description by corollary of the average profile.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And of course, all this phenomenology that we're talking about is for radio emission. In X-ray emission or the high energy emission, one has not seen this behavior. And also, it's not that easy to track individual single pulses for most pulsars at higher energies.
Yeah, so just for completeness, let me, although you did answer the question about the multi-frequency probe spectrum, nulls are seen to occur simultaneously at all the frequencies. That means the real broadband phenomena of the nulling. And more often than not, the post-null behavior has shown some memory of, that there was a null in terms of the drifting behavior or any other peculiar things which relate to having started the engine again. Things are cranking up. So, for example, the drift rate is seen to ramp up to the normal rate after the null in a fashion which is almost traceable. It doesn't come back, although the brightness might come back. The drifting behavior doesn't come back immediately to the normal drifting behavior. It takes a couple of pulses before a couple of cycles to do that. Whereas pre-null, there have not been many convincing indications of a warning of a null to come.
Yeah. Yeah, so post-null recovery is actually more gradual than
There's a question in the chat from Parul. If the nulls have a lower limit in terms of definition, even if they're missing just for 1 to 3 pulses, whether it could be called a null. As long as you're sure that it's intrinsic, I think you can call it a null, right?
I guess so. I mean, if it is just one period, it might be hard to.
No, one period nulls are.
One period nulls are seen.
And you would call it a null.
Yeah. Well, what is most interesting to ask, and the answer is not known, is if nulling is simply switching off some machinery and everything switches off. Why null has not been seen in the middle of a pulse, middle of the pulse window, so to say.
That is why some sparks go. No, go ahead.
Yeah. So this is related to my current work. Now I am seeing nulls in some cases, which are just 1 pulse wide or 2 pulse wide. And the issue is, I don't know if my sensitivity is not good enough to call it a null, or or if it is really a null. So what can be my check here? Should I take that pulse as a null or not? It's random and within a subpulse sequence, like within a drift band.
But does the drift band show any change in behavior?
How do you mean?
Pre and post, does the drift band slope change?
No, not really. I mean, it's as if you have done a lot of cuts in the drift mode. So in one kind of drift mode, I see a lot of frequent, very short nulls.
No, these are subpulse drifters, right? So you have a certain slope of drifting, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So when you say that you are seeing a null, immediately after that, are you seeing a change in the drift slope?
No, I'm not seeing a change.
How often do these nulls happen? So between two nulls, how many pulses do you have?
For the nulls which are 1 to 2 pulse wide, the difference could be like 5 to 8 pulses, 10 pulses at max. So I've got 10 regular pulses, then a null of 1-2 pulses wide, and then a sequence, something like that.
So with that small number of pulses, even a change in drift rate may be difficult to figure out.
No. And also, I think Joanna and I talked about if you have this structure of, not azimuthally smooth structure of emission with these sub-beams and so on, there could be pretty often situations of empty passes through the, you can take your locus of the observer and take certain orientation of this pattern. And you might, cut the cone through the regions between the bright spots. And that might appear like a null. It's not a real null in the sense of switching off the machinery, which all this.
So I'm just passing through a region where there are no sparks.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what Dipankar said will be relevant. You will see the corresponding manifestations post-null in terms of something. Either the phase is remembered from the old one, and suddenly there's a phase jump in the drift pattern, and so on.
Without that, it is difficult to call it a null. Right? So you may simply have a low intensity or just a gap in the spark distribution.
Okay. And the thing that you were saying that switching off, sort of switching off between the pulse, switching off of emission between the pulse, one single pulse. Isn't that something which you see in bi-drifting? Like almost on the edges, you see drift modes, and in the center there is almost nothing.
No. They could be drifting in the, depends on how you're cutting the cone and where the drifting is occurring. Those situations can be pretty complex. But that's not what I was referring to. I was talking about, imagine a normal profile that you expect to get in a reasonably steady pulsar, which we always see the fuller profile, and then we may not get the next pulse, due to nulls or whatever it is. But one has never seen, or at least I don't know of an example reported, where in the middle of the pulse, things have switched off. After all, you get the next pulse, sometime during that rotation, part of the rotation that you did not see, something must have been switched off, right? Whatever. Why has that never been seen happening during your transit through the beam.
Isn't that inherently hard because the subpulses sometimes come and sometimes don't? Even if it is happening in the middle of the pulse, you won't know it's just the pulse-to-pulse variation, or
No, but it would be sharp then. It would be sharp, and that's one chance of getting to know how gradually things happen. So other way of saying it is, it's not all sudden, although it might appear like, because we are sampling only once a period, that it appears sudden. The process might be that, it modified the pulse a little bit and you did not attribute it to any, sudden change.
I think the phenomenology of pulse-to-pulse variation itself is so diverse. Attributing something as approach to null it has not been possible to clearly identify that. I think that's the main problem.
I don't know whether I understood this correctly. There are these subpulses which go and make the main pulse, and these subpulses are drifting presumably at different rates. These subpulses have certain widths or whatever. Then can you just check with whether you can sort of slide them back and forth and see whether there are situations where the low portion of one and the low portion of another is overlapping at exactly the time when you expect the main pulse, and so produce those nulls, which I'm sorry, I don't know her name. She was talking about different drift rates and different subpulses.
I think that's
they
what
can
Desh was mentioning.
To produce nulls.
No,
that's not
cancellation.
Yeah, go ahead, Desh, go ahead. Yeah.
No. I was just trying to understand the question. Is she referring to some cancellation?
No, not cancellation. Right. From what I understood, there are subpulses which drift. And subpulses go and the combination of these make the main pulse. If the subpulses are drifting at different rates, then there can be situations where the low intensity portion of one pulse and low intensity portion of another pulse is what you are going to catch at the pulsar period. Then those, two nulls and then some again pulses coming up sort of situation can come up. It is not a nulling. It's just that you're not seeing pulses there.
Yeah.
That's all.
So that's what I was referring to. I was referring to the same situation where there is a empty pass through the pattern.
Okay.
There it's low intensity in the pattern.
Okay.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the one I was referring to, which is not a real null, but it appears like low intensity on both the components or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, the context would be clearer if you go to that carousel picture where you have sort of a ring of sparks, and this ring is rotating. And as it rotates, and it is rotating at a period which is different from the spin period of the pulsar. And at different passes, you are seeing different orientations of this ring. And so each spark sort of moves in pulse longitude because of this, because this ring is rotating and you are seeing this at different phases. So in between those subpulses, there could be regions where there is no emission at all. And one of your passes could just cut that region, and then you will not see an emission for that particular period.
Oh, maybe I'm not understanding the subpulse drift issue very well. So the drift of the subpulse is with respect to the rotation phase, I guess. And
so let's say in one particular period, the subpulse that you saw appeared at phase phi1. In the next period, again you see a subpulse that appears at phase phi2. In the following period, it appears at a phase phi3. Now these phases have a regular progression. And this is what's called a subpulse drift from phi1 to phi2 to phi3. So it will go from one end of the main pulse to another, and then it will sort of wrap back and then come back again in phase and things like that. So this is captured in this picture of a carousel of sparks which is rotating, and your line of sight is cutting this carousel of sparks. So at each time when this carousel of sparks makes the beam, at each time, at each rotation period, when you're looking at this beam, you are seeing a slightly rotated view of this carousel because the carousel is rotating by itself by E cross B drift. And this carousel has bright points, and the pulse longitude at which that bright point cuts is your subpulse. And that longitude will keep moving because this whole pattern is rotating as a function of time. So that's the geometric view that has been used in this description.
I think the portion which I couldn't understand was Desh mentioning about the statistics of the subpulse, the distribution.
Yes, so the subpulses will be more frequently, will appear more frequently in some longitudes, less frequently in other longitudes. Wherever it appears more frequently, you will have, when you add hundreds and thousands of pulses, you will have an average profile which is stronger at those longitudes where subpulses appear more frequently, and weaker where the subpulses appear less frequently. That's what he was talking about in terms of average profiles. Average profile is not made of one pulse. You have to add thousands of pulses to get the average profile.
So this more frequently and less frequently appearing is related to the carousel speed?
No.
No, that gives you the drift. This is related to the distribution of sparks on the carousel.
And there are multiple carousels?
You may have, but I guess one carousel is enough in most cases to explain.
And one carousel is difficult enough to even produce and, explain its behavior. So one hopes that there is only one seed pattern.
So instead of more frequent subpulses in around one longitude, you can also have just very bright subpulses over there, and that will also give you a much stronger profile in that longitude.
It could, but what Desh was pointing out is that if you look at the subpulse statistics, the pulse profile almost mimics the occurrence probability. So this is an observational fact.
In fact, the components, the so-called components of an average profile have been appreciated to practically define the frequency of occurrence and, rather than the intensity per se of the component as a whole.
So this
because
is...
the beta fire is, more frequent occurrences in certain longitude range.
So this is frequency of subpulse versus longitude, right?
Yes.
So
that mimics the average profile. That's the observational fact. So in principle, what you say is certainly possible, but in practice, what it seems to reflect is the occurrence statistics.
Okay.